There is a silence inside the civil rights movement that history never talks about. Not the silence of the marches, not the silence of the jails. A different kind. The kind that gets manufactured carefully, deliberately, by the very people holding the microphone. Some names get carved into monuments, others get buried beneath them. And the ones doing the burying aren't always who you think. Lock your doors, put on your headphones, because after this video, you will never look at the civil rights movement the same way again. It began on a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Not in December, not with Rosa Parks. 9 months earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, a 15-year-old girl sat down and refused to move. Her name was Claudette Colvin. She was a student at Booker T. Washington High School. She had been studying the Constitution in class that week, not as an abstract document, as a promise. She had been reading it the way you read something that finally explains why everything around you feels wrong. She knew her rights, and when the driver ordered her to give up her seat to a white passenger, something in her didn't bend. She said no, not quietly, not politely, not with the careful composure of someone who had been trained for this moment. She said no, and she meant it. The police were called. 2 officers boarded the bus. When they tried to drag her from her seat, she grabbed the seat in front of her and held on. They handcuffed her. A 15-year-old girl, handcuffed on a city bus in broad daylight in front of a full load of passengers. Then they dragged her off, threw her into a squad car, and took her to an adult jail. She was charged with disturbing the peace, violating segregation laws, and assaulting an officer. She sat in that cell alone. No cameras outside, no leaflets being printed, no one calling her brave. Just a girl in a concrete room who had done exactly what the Constitution told her she had the right to do. That should have been the beginning of everything. It wasn't. It was the beginning of her erasure. The NAACP knew about Claudette Colvin within days of her arrest. Local leaders held meetings. They discussed whether her case could be used to challenge bus segregation in federal court. They had been waiting for exactly this moment. A clear arrest, a clear injustice, a plaintiff willing to fight. She was right there, but the meetings went longer than they should have. The assessments took longer than they needed to. And the verdict, when it came quiet. Claudette Colvin was not the right face. She was young. She was dark-skinned. She was described in internal discussions as mouthy and feisty and difficult. And by the time the conversations had gone far enough, another detail had surfaced. She was pregnant, 15 years old, jailed for knowing her rights, and pregnant. To the leadership of the Montgomery NAACP, that combination was a liability. They worried she would be torn apart on the witness stand, that the opposition would weaponize her, that the public, even the black public, wouldn't rally behind her the way they needed. What they needed, they told themselves, was someone dignified, someone beyond reproach, someone whose image the press couldn't twist into a weapon against the cause. Those were real concerns. The movement was operating in a brutal environment where one wrong headline could set everything back by years. But here is what that calculation cost. It cost a 15-year-old girl in a jail cell the right to be recognized for what she had already risked. So they waited, and that should be where the story ends. It doesn't. 8 months later, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. Rosa Parks was 42. She was a trained activist, the secretary of the local NAACP chapter, light-skinned, composed, and carefully presented. When she was arrested, the movement was ready. Leaflets were printed overnight. The boycott launched within days. The machine had been built. It just needed the right person to stand in front of it. Claudette Colvin was not invited to stand there. Here is what most people do not know. After her arrest, after the movement decided she wasn't useful enough, Claudette Colvin still showed up. She became one of 4 plaintiffs in Browder versus Gale, the federal lawsuit that actually struck down bus segregation in Montgomery. Not the boycott. The lawsuit, argued in part by a 15-year-old girl who had already been told she wasn't good enough. The Supreme Court ruled in their favor in November 1956. The buses were legally desegregated because of that case. Rosa Parks became an icon. Claudette Colvin became a footnote. When the story was written, when the speeches were given, when the textbooks were printed, her name was quietly removed. Not by accident, by design. She moved to New York City in 1958. She worked as a nurse's aide for decades. She raised her son. She lived quietly, while the woman the movement chose in her place was celebrated, honored, and eulogized by presidents. For most of her adult life, school children across America were taught that the Montgomery bus boycott began in December 1955. 9 months were simply removed from history, and the girl who filled those 9 months went home to an empty apartment and raised her child alone. But that's not even the part that should stop you cold. The civil rights movement was built on one argument above all others: that human dignity cannot be conditional, that justice cannot be selective, that a person's worth is not determined by how convenient they are to the cause. And then they looked at a 15-year-old girl who had proven every single one of those principles at personal cost, in real time, alone, and they said she wasn't respectable enough. Think about what that means. The people marching in the streets for dignity were making decisions about whose dignity was worth protecting, based on skin tone, on pregnancy, on personality, the same measuring stick the system had always used, just held by different hands. And nobody talked about it. Not openly, not honestly. The leaders who made that decision went on to give speeches that filled arenas and moved nations. They stood at podiums and invoked the names of the forgotten, while actively keeping one name buried. Claudette Colvin was alive the whole time, working her shift, raising her child, reading the history books that left her out. There is something almost unbearable about that image. A woman who changed history, sitting in a break room somewhere in New York, watching the civil rights anniversaries on the evening news, hearing the names recited one by one, knowing her own was not among them. Not because she wasn't there, because she was there first, and that was exactly the problem. In later interviews, she was gracious. She said she didn't resent Rosa Parks, that Rosa Parks was a good woman who deserved her honor. But she also said something that almost no one quoted. She said the teachers in her community knew what had happened. They just didn't talk about it. That the silence wasn't ignorance. It was a choice. She said, "I felt like Sojourner Truth was pushing down on one shoulder, and Harriet Tubman was pushing down on the other, saying, 'Sit down, girl.' And I just couldn't move. She couldn't move, but history could. And it moved her right out of the story. It wasn't until 2005, 50 years after her arrest, that Claudette Colvin received any meaningful public recognition. A few documentaries, a handful of articles. Her name quietly added to some school curricula in scattered districts across the country. Not a monument, not a national holiday, not a postage stamp. A few paragraphs in the margins of a story that had been told without her for half a century. She was 70 years old before most Americans had ever heard her name. 70 years old. And the reason it took that long isn't complicated. It's uncomfortable. Because the people who buried her weren't villains in white hoods. They were activists, organizers, people who genuinely believed in justice, people who gave their lives to the movement. They just decided that justice had a dress code, that the girl at the front of the line had to look a certain way, had to have the right complexion, the right composure, the right story for the press. And when Claudette Colvin didn't meet that standard, they didn't fight to change the standard. They changed the girl. They found someone else. That is the part they don't put in the lesson plan. Not because it's false, because it's true, because it reveals that the struggle for liberation, like every human institution, was capable of its own hierarchies, its own sacrifices, its own quiet cruelties, and the quietest cruelty of all was making a 15-year-old girl feel like what she had done wasn't enough, that who she was wasn't enough. She had sat down on a city bus in a state where that act could get you killed. She had grabbed that seat with both hands while officers tried to drag her off. She had gone to jail alone, been dragged through the courts, been called difficult and unsuitable and inconvenient, and still shown up to testify in the federal case that actually ended segregation on those buses. She did all of that, and they gave the credit to someone else. There is a seat on a Montgomery bus that changed America. The textbooks will tell you who sat in it. They just got the date wrong by 9 months. And the girl who sat there first went home to an empty house, raised her child alone, and watched someone else receive the crown she had already earned. Maybe the hardest thing about this story isn't what the white establishment did. It's what the movement did when it thought no one was watching. Because sometimes the people who fight hardest for justice are the first ones to decide whose justice counts. And sometimes the most dangerous erasure doesn't come from your enemies. It comes from the people standing right beside you, speaking your language, carrying your flag, marching your streets, and quietly deciding that you are the acceptable sacrifice, the one who doesn't fit the image, the one who gets left out of the story, the one whose name the textbook skips over on its way to someone else. Her name was Claudette Colvin. She was 15 years old, and she didn't move.